Hello. Hello. Welcome to week 7 of Hot Pot Talk Season 2. I am Jen Sunshine here with my dear friend and longtime creative partner, David Ng. We are the co-artistic directors of Love Intersections, a media arts collective that produces documentary films about QT BIPOCs. We're also members of the Vancouver Artists Labor Union Cooperative, also known as Value Co-op. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that we are gathered here today from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We wish to continue highlighting the work of the land defenders at Fairy Creek. Despite signing the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, the BC government has continued to authorize the logging of old-growth forests on Indigenous territories on Vancouver Island. There's a GoFundMe to support Indigenous land defenders dropping into the chat now. Hot Pot Talks is a weekly series live streaming to YouTube and Facebook every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific time, where we have free-flowing conversations with artists, activists, chefs, performers, poets, community organizers about what it means to be an artist facing today's realities. What ethical responsibilities do we have as artists? This season, we continue these conversations on topics ranging from anti-Asian racism, BIPOC futurity, Chinatown solidarity, diasporic food cultures, and interrogating the boundaries between everyday activism, fine art, and cultural work.
Yeah, so why Hot Pot Talks? We founded Love Intersections on core philosophies of collaboration, doing work by invitation and in collaboration with communities to tell stories that intervene on systems such as race, gender, sexuality, class, and ableism. And a core part of our work as social practice artists has been to interrogate the boundaries of art, philosophy, community work, and activism. And also art philosophy. And so when the pandemic happened earlier last year, and a lot of our creative practice that involved working with communities took a pause, we imagined Hot Pot Talks as a way to continue this dialogue on art, culture production, and labor with guests that we wanted to connect with that had contributed to this work.
Okay, so you're probably bored of hearing me plug our Have You Eaten Today totes by now.
There's a twist today.
So we are very excited to announce our new merch line. So we had to come up with something new to sell our souls away. We designed a new line of black tees and totes with this design on the screen right now. These were designed by our fellow Value Co-op member, Annie Canto, who incorporated our favorite Napa cabbage theme that we are still obsessed with, as well as rendering my father's calligraphy into the design, translating to "Have you eaten today" in Chinese. You can purchase these at valuecoop.ca.
Great. And Cameron will drop a link in the chat right now. I also just wanted to mention, these totes are actually also they're sewn from our sister co-op, the Vancouver Sewing Labor Union Cooperative. And our the people, Lamia, who is our social media coordinator, actually sews these tote bags at VSLU. we just made that connection. So it's a very, very, very locally made product.
It's definitely within 100 Mile. It's organic. It's sewn by our own hands.
Yes, organic cotton and everything.
So speaking of our team, I want to thank our incredible team, Cameron, our lead project coordinator, and Lamia, our social media coordinator and sewer, who helped make Hot Pot Talks a reality. So I want to introduce our guests today. Diasporic Dynasty is a newly established Black, Indigenous, and persons of color collective aiming to champion and uplift the stories of BIPOC within the Vancouver Performing Arts communities. Our group comprises of burlesque and drag performers who have performed around the province over the past decade. Thus, our practice largely centers on movement, striptease, and satire while celebrating the diversity in our voices and paths. The name Diasporic Dynasty represents two truths: that collectively we are the descendants of those that have been scattered and displaced by colonialism, that also collectively we are the descendants of mighty and magnificent peoples. Please give me a warm welcome to members Roxy, Reverie, and Viktoria Kourt. Welcome.
Hey guys.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you all doing? It's so good to have you on.
Yeah, it's so great to be here. I am like amazed by the platform. There's like so many like cool things to look at. So it's great.
Yeah, listen, we had the exact same reaction when we first discovered. I think it was actually David who discovered this because he had to use this platform, StreamYard, on some academic panel. And he was like, Jen, you gotta check this out. You're really nerdy about technology and like efficient working, like smooth platforms. And I was like, okay, so let's try it out. Here we are like months later. Love it.
Sorry, not a plug for StreamYard, but
not sponsored by StreamYard.
But you can also stream to multiple platforms too. So this is on like all of our Facebook and different channels as well. Anyway.
Yeah, it feels very high tech.
Yes. How are you, Viktoria?
I'm doing good. My armpits are sweaty, but I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I know. I was saying to Jen, I've blasted this tiny little AC machine for the past hour and a half. So I hope the room stays cool enough for the next hour before I start sweating too. So I thought maybe we could kick off with a light question. I'm curious, how did you guys meet? And maybe if you could tell us how you guys started Diasporic Dynasty. I love the name and I love the description behind it as well.
Yeah. So I personally know Viktoria just from taking classes in the area. So before Diasporic Dynasty was a collective thing. So generally speaking, a lot of us in the collective have known each other for at least a couple of years before we kind of came together. And in terms of, how we came together, with everything going on, we were like, it's about time that we actually put our efforts together. We've been working as individuals. So let's just like make stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess to add, this is kind of years in the making, right? So I think I met Roxy in early 2019, and obviously BIPOC performers have existed in Vancouver way before that. So I think there's always been conversations about wanting to do something together, wanting to do a show that's fully BIPOC produced and cast. But I think it's really with in June, July-ish last year, we finally said okay, let's do this. Let's create a group. Let's just make it. And then we had our first show in September last year. Is that September, right?
Yeah, sometime. Time is not real, right? So
September 2020. Yeah, that's last year, right? Time.
Yeah. Wow, cool.
So that was your first show. That was your inaugural show. Is that the right word?
Yeah, it's funny because we were all separated. So we had a show together, but we were only in groups of 3 at most because it was still, kind of the peak of everything and inside. But we were able to get a summer subsidy from KW Studios that allowed us to have this first filmed showcase that we produced and put out online in the fall. So it was a first show in that it was our acts are together, but we're still excited to have our first kind of event where we're actually all in the same space and we can kind of share in that collective joy of seeing each other. So yeah.
I guess I have a question. I'm hearing a lot of similar. I mean, this is why Jen and I started Love Intersections, was because of the lack of. At the time, we were approaching it from a representation perspective. We're thinking about things a little bit differently now, a little bit deeper. But the lack of BIPOC stories in the queer community that celebrated BIPOC lives. I'm curious because I've also Jen and I were joking earlier because we're both graduates of early 2000s women's studies. So I know a lot of people that do burlesque, right? Just from being around people like in that community. I'm curious because I've just as an outsider, I've kind of noticed recently over the past 2 years, like different BIPOC focused burlesque acts or groups or initiatives. Can you tell me a little bit about the scene right now and how that emerged?
Yeah, and Viktoria, also feel free to like chime in whenever I talk a lot. Yeah, so just to preface this, like, I'm pretty new to this scene. So I've only been performing. I mean, I've been performing in other kind of venues for a while, but I started performing. I debuted in 2018. So this is like my second-ish year in. But even within those 2 years, I definitely saw an uptick of more kind of BIPOC and QT BIPOC performances kind of happening. And, I think it's just like kind of while there's an ongoing conversation just generally in the world about like we need representation, it just kind of parallels within the art form, right? So
Right.
people are kind of seeing what's going on in just the outside world in terms of these discussions, and they're like, okay, how can I bring this into my own art, right? And I guess just seeing other people like you doing that kind of work, you're gonna just motivate more people, right, to get involved, new people to get involved. So at least from my 2-ish years starting here, that's my experience.
Cool.
Yeah, I guess I would say like my very limited experience is also similar, and I think in terms of Vancouver, I don't know if I could speak to that accurately, but like what I've noticed is that like in a lot of online spaces, like you really see a lot of like BIPOC people making their own shows, making their own festivals, and like really just like taking everything. They're on the steering wheel, and then they've curated these spaces just for BIPOC.
Yeah, I confess to being have a very limited understanding of burlesque. Like my first burlesque show was in like the mid to late 2000s. David and I met, and David mentioned that we were both women's studies majors at the time, and that was like my entry into burlesque. And I've always found that it was viewed through like a predominantly white feminist lens in terms of like the scholarship, the study. But also I was in and around it because I was going to like gay bars, like lesbian bars and lesbian shows, which had a very tight knit relationship with burlesque inherently, just drag in general. Right. But I confess to not sticking in that scene. I kind of veered off. So I actually don't know what's how it has evolved over the past 10 years. And I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because as I'm kind of on this own burlesque journey myself, it can even just be what circles within burlesque you're kind of a part of, right? So when my introduction to burlesque, before I got involved, I was in college, and Brown Radical Ass Burlesque was my first burlesque show. They're based in New York City.
Wow.
And they are just I mean, the name, it just describes exactly what they are. They're so funny and like insightful and political, and it has that just the resistance is there, right? In this very kind of like non-mainstream way. So, it was actually kind of surprising because that was my introduction to the art form. And then I kind of saw the more mainstream stuff as I started to get involved in a different scene and just broadly speaking. And it was kind of like a shock to me of like, oh, I expected this to be maybe a little bit more radical in that area. But I think the burlesque scene has always had QT BIPOC people, just maybe the kind of the mainstream, right? Like anything is typically pretty white, straight, femme, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, Victoria, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess just to add, I kind of have like the opposite experience, which is, I guess, my first experience seeing a burlesque performer was actually also a drag performer. Like the drag queen Violet Chachki was here in Vancouver a few years ago. So that was the first time I went, wow, like I didn't know this was possible. And then I think the very first like show, exclusively burlesque show that I saw was like a Dita Von T show. So it was like, you could see how different these experiences are. And, you know, so I definitely agree with Roxy. It depends on what circles you also run into. Because prior to seeing BIPOC, cutie BIPOC burlesque, like I didn't know that, you know, the stuff that BIPOC performers are doing, I didn't know that was possible. And, you know, so it was almost liberating to see what could be achieved in this art form.
Cool. I have a question, since, you know, we open this, we open every episode talking about interrogating boundaries, but there's an interesting encounter we're talking about between drag and burlesque. And I'm thinking about like the documentary that we made with Kendall, Yellow Peril Queer Destiny, and so Kendall's drag name is Made in China. She also performs with the Darlings, and so I'm thinking about like Made in China's work. She talks about in the documentary really about ripping apart those boxes that say this is drag, this is art, this is not drag, this is not art. And I think about like some of the boundaries that the Darlings are pushing as well. I'm curious because you guys also mentioned you also have, I think, drag performers in your community as well. I don't. This is a very large question, I guess. But what is that encounter like? Is there a tension between what is considered burlesque and drag? Are there crossovers? What's that conversation like?
Yeah, so right now, the only person I think of as our drag performer is Nick Spookaroo, who is so dope. I think even though we want to keep Diasporic Dynasty as like a really broad drag and burlesque and other types of performance, we are primarily burlesque still within our own circle. So it's definitely something I would love to see expanded, just because I think I'm kind of like one of those people that like creeps at like drag shows and is like, I really want to try this thing. I really want to do it. It's not my circle. And it's interesting because I've actually performed at, you know, drag shows. And even there, I felt as a burlesque artist, like the norms were so different. And like, I was like, oh, there's like not a kitty to pick up my clothes for me. Like, you know what I mean? Like it was just like, and it was so funny because it feels like the art form is so similar, right? But it is a completely different, or maybe not completely different, but I personally haven't been able to experience the overlap quite as much as I would love to see it, right? And maybe that has to do just with our particular scene, right? It could be that our scene, there's more of that boundary, right, between the drag and the burlesque scene, whereas in other kind of places, other cities, there's less of that divide. Yeah, Victoria, I don't know if you've had any like other experiences in terms of.
Yeah, definitely thought of Mixed Bookaroo, but also like I think last year Sparkle Plenty did this amazing number where she was basically Justin Trudeau.
Yeah,
it was
oh my God, about that.
Pipelines. It was amazing. So, but as far as like how each art translates into the other, I don't know if I could speak more effectively to that. But that was just the first thing that came into my mind was that number, because it was.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I think Roxy, from what I'm understanding, the form is actually also quite different. Like the way that burlesque, the form can be quite different from drag. Yeah.
It's interesting too, because from what I've seen, we have a lot of burlesque artists who might like dip their toes into drag, right? So it's like the boundary is there, but it's still blurred because people like, you know, they can like experiment with different formats, and I'm sure vice versa, right? You have like drag performers in the community who I've seen do burlesque, right? So I don't think it's completely separated. I just wish it was maybe a little bit more overlap. Like I'd love to see more drag in our own shows. Yeah.
I'm curious how you would describe your own personal style as like a performer.
Oh, that's a good one.
Because I mean, for me, it's like it's always evolving, always changing, right? But I'm curious, what is it in the moment, and what are you hoping to explore for yourself?
I guess for me, Viktoria is all about the Baduy, Bakya, and Jologs. So those three terms are basically Filipino concepts that kind of mean the same thing. You know, lowbrow, tacky, dated. You know, stuff that you wouldn't really want to be caught listening to, or you'd be shamed into liking. You know, something that only like poor people like, essentially.
Yeah.
Or, so I kind of wanted to, it's just very mainstream stuff, but it's not elevated or highbrow. So that's the style musically and performatively that I'm trying to reclaim. Because growing up, I can confess this now because I'm not ashamed of liking the certain singers and whatnot. But when I was a kid, like I didn't want to be caught like humming to like some novelty singer's song, or like I didn't want to be exposed as liking this girl group on a noontime variety show. And now I can say that proudly.
And then was this in the the Philippines?
Yeah. So so I guess the root of Viktoria basically is just kind of trying to like excavate those like pop culture references that people are trying to bury because they're not high art.
There's some amazing art that's coming from the Philippines right now, and like I would regard them as like very highbrow art. I just discovered this Netflix show called Trece, which is an animated show done entirely from the Philippines, and it's on like the monsters, and so I have a sort of an obsession with Filipino monsters, like the aswang and the I think it's mananangan, manananga, just the monster and the tales that are told that are so rampant in the Philippines. I'm quite fascinated by it. Any case, I'm digressing, but there's some incredible stories coming out of the Philippines right now, and I would love to see like a burlesque show that like has monsters in it. Yeah, I love that stuff. Anyway, Roxy, how would you describe your own personal style?
I feel like it's like you need to slow down. Like that's the style. Is like you're running from side of the stage to the other side of the stage. So yeah, it's interesting because I see burlesque very much as a way that I relate to music, because I was kind of thinking about this of like, what do I do it for, right? And I just love the theatrics of a song. You know what I mean? Like so a song, I will kind of have this experience when I listen to it of like, I see this color scheme, I see this kind of like fabric texture, I see this kind of lighting. So I kind of I often come at my numbers not necessarily with narrative, but with aesthetic, and that aesthetic and that music that really gets me going tends to be really like high powered stuff, which, obviously translates to like, if the music's fast, your body wants to move fast. Right.
Yes.
So I guess Roxy as kind of a character is just generally very like cheeky, like will like kick you in the face if you're not too careful, like kind of like side eye given. I'm like originally from New Jersey, so that's a whole part of the kind of shtick is like a person from New Jersey who is very like no shits given. Which it's, you know, it's interesting too, right? Because it's like me, right? Like it's like my character is not necessarily completely divorced from who I am. It's a extension with like, oh, I also really like adding this other like extra glittery stuff on top, right? So
Right. Cool. Roxy, earlier we were asking you about school. Can you tell us
writing all day.
Yes, can you tell us what you're writing about or studying?
Yeah. So just this is like such a different mode I have to put my brain in. so sorry if this comes out a little bit slower. Yeah, so basically what I'm interested in is thinking about how people take action in terms of support for people who are marginalized and minoritized. So with the conversations, especially recently, you know, like people are saying, what can I do? And so I'm kind of interested in unpacking, right? Like there are so many possible things someone can do in support of different groups. What is actually considered most effective and when? Particularly from the perspective of the people, right? Like that those actions are trying to support. So I'm really interested kind of in thinking about, you know, when motives are a little bit sus, right? So like, you know, what kind of actions seem more performative versus more authentic? I'm interested in looking at so I often study women in STEM, particularly. So what women in STEM kind of want from men in their group to do, and then what are men actually motivated to do, right? So it's very binary in that way, what I study. So I say men and women very specifically because that's unfortunately like the binary that I work in. But yeah, but just trying to kind of figure out like, okay, like motivation and actual desire and active effectiveness and when are you sus? Yeah, so it's really interesting. I
find that I'm just sus all the time. Like 100% of the time. I'm just like, I'm moving in the world very skeptical now.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting too, because like, I think I have that perspective also. And I think like that really bleeds into the kind of work that I do, right? Like, why do I study what is sus? It's because I am sus, right? So I'm trying to just kind of figure that thing out, but also centering the perspective of the person who is, you know, being disadvantaged versus kind of thinking, okay, like what do white and straight and men want to do? Like, I don't care about that. I care about what is actually helpful and necessary.
Yeah. So. Well, it's making me think about, you know, we were talking about EDI earlier, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, right? Like how many times have we, you know, and everyone's talking about this too, like, you know, last year, every organization, every fitness studio and restaurant was hosting one EDI workshop, right? Like it really just, I think, speaks to, again, this sort of sus motive of, you know, what are you going to actually achieve? You know, you're not gonna get rid of white supremacy in one 4-hour workshop.
Well, so because with something like that, it's just so transparent and performative, right? Like there's a performative allyship that's happening where you see it rampant on social media, and they'll just post a thing, and then that's.
Yeah, I would even say also when there's a crisis too, when organizations have to respond, but, you know, even if it's a week or 2 weeks or even a month, like that, like to deal with, I'm just using racism as an example, but other, you know, obviously like cis heteropatriarchy as well. But those things that are so deeply embodied in us take a little bit more time
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
scope for your facilitators. Sorry, I'm getting going on a rant, but scope for your facilitators to actually deal with that type of work. Viktoria, you mentioned you also had some experiences with EDI. Did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so yeah, it's funny that you mentioned like these 1 4 hour workshops, and then there's no follow up whatsoever.
No.
That's it. That's the work.
We've
Exactly.
solved white supremacy in 4 hours.
Yeah, and I find that in my I do a lot more like a community based work, but I have like of course like experiences in like other organizations and in academia and just going out to the Filipinx community,
Mhm.
and yeah, it's really. And I find it funny too that like it's so easy to snuff out who's sus and who's not. So I was just all using the word sus this episode. Yeah, and I find that in the work that I'm doing, so last year, like I started like hosting writing workshops for, specifically for the Filipinx community because, a lot of people in our community are frontline workers.
Yeah.
So, so having that space to like just like, relax and like kind of unpack what they've been experiencing, that they may not even know how to process yet. That was really telling in terms of like, what are your employers doing? Like, what's going on? Like, they're not giving you the appropriate and adequate support at all to like process this trauma and the experiences you're going through right now, especially being separated from family back home, and and I guess we could go on another tangent on how like different countries are kind of dealing with the pandemic, and the Philippines is dealing with it really terribly. So
Yeah.
how's that for adding more worries onto your plate as you're trying to work here?
Yeah.
Well, in your bio, you mentioned that outside of burlesque, you're also a poet, editor, translator, educator, and arts administrator. So it sounds like you wear a lot of hats outside of burlesque. Can you tell us a little bit more about those areas of your life?
Yeah. So I actually moved to Vancouver because I wanted to study poetry. So I went to UBC, did that for a while, and navigating academia, and like also with that literary magazines and these like other outside literary institutions, and how they hold power over like to dictate what's good literature and what's not. That was a really sobering experience, and kind of really, I think, shaped the way I teach and the way I approach my poetry, because I think as Roxy mentioned earlier, it's like, who are you doing this for? Like, why are you doing this work? So, and for me, it's like my community is a primary audience. So, you can take it or leave it at that. And also teaching them, because, from the Philippines, like, we're taught like, English is spoken a certain way. If you speak English, you are smart. So growing up, I always thought I was smart because I spoke English, and turns out I'm not that smart. But it's kind of it really takes a lot of patience to like teach people who have been raised with this kind of mindset that you have to speak perfect English, you have to write perfect English. It really takes a lot of work to tell them, it's like, no, English is whatever you want it to be, because and you can also put in like Filipino words, or like whatever your native language is. That's on you. That's not for anyone to judge. And poetry for me, it's supposed to be a space of among other things, it's a space for like healing and processing all our experiences diluted into like a single page or 100, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, what you're talking about really resonates with me. I think about like, just going off of the EDI conversation too, like I'm just thinking about what storytelling and art can get to in terms of oppression and all these systemic stuff that we're talking about. Like Viktoria, when you're talking about like how you're using poetry to address all of these different community layers linked to race and all of these other pieces. I don't think an EDI workshop could get to half of those things effectively, I hate using that word, but as deeply or more embodied. And I'm thinking about that even in terms of Jen, our work, our making documentary, but also even like burlesque, even the stuff that you're sharing right now about like sharing BIPOC stories on a in the burlesque, through a burlesque medium, if you will. That also, I think, is doing a very different work than an EDI workshop. Sorry, I'm bashing EDI workshops really bad right now.
It's awful.
I
Yeah.
may just add too. Sorry, you mentioned storytelling, and I had this conversation a while ago with another member of our collective, Androsia Wild, and and I've had this conversations with like plenty of BIPOC friend. The way we're judged for our work, not just as like burlesque performers, but also like as artists. The different arts that we partake in general.
Yeah.
I think what the white supremacist lens does not take into account with the way we're judged with our work is that as BIPOC, we all come from like so many different storytelling traditions, and that really kind of filters into our work in one way or another, consciously or unconsciously. We have like different genealogies, in terms of like performance and literary, and those histories are not necessarily kind of like a Western art form for like, so it could be like Jen, you were talking about like these ghost stories earlier. That's that's part of our history in storytelling.
Yeah.
And gossiping, when you have like these aunts gossiping at like a reunion, that's also part of your history and your storytelling tradition.
Yes.
That's so funny. We always joke. Jen, have I talked about this? It's like the Chinese anti-gossip grapevine.
Yeah,
That, like,
yeah.
there's like very key gossip stories that I don't know where this comes from. But
I think there is a chismis like auntie in every culture. Like there's just the like really nosy auntie that knows all of the gossip.
Yeah, that's me, by the way.
I'm actually I want to ask you two, because you two, I want to know what your perception of Vancouver is, and feel free to go all out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't look at the stats before I moved here because so I'm Black. Yeah. I'm from the New York City area, right?
Yeah.
I'm from Jersey, but Metro New York is a suburb, right, of New York City. So it's something that I struggle with in terms of finding people and community. I mean, I have a pretty strange upbringing because I was raised by primarily white people because I'm mixed, but I still have the Black American experience, just given the body that I'm in. So yeah, it's been really interesting kind of working on and thinking about my own identity at the same time being in a place where Blackness is very different than an American sense of Blackness, right? And then just kind of like, I don't want to say lack thereof, because there are Black communities here, but they're more sporadic, right? And spread out. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, like the mountains are really beautiful, and I'm glad and I'm thankful for the community that I have made here, right? Like it's not, I think I have a lot of angst about Vancouver just because it'll never be New York City, and I'm biased that way, but I am thankful, right, to be able to be here and be a settler here and learn here, right? So at the same time, I don't mean to completely bash the city. I just wish it was a little bit easier to kind of find what's happening.
It's a conversation that comes up quite a bit with I'm in school right now, and I remember having this conversation with the international students. Like it's not even just hard to find community, but also like what's happening is sort of, you can't Google search I'm just thinking like the art scene. You can't really come by it by the Google search, right? And to really sort of, Jen, I think you say it takes, was it 3 years?
It takes 3 years to really find a sense of at the very least comfort and a sense of ease. But as someone that's lived in Vancouver for 20 years, it's still very hostile to me. I love observing and like watching Vancouver, because I think it's a city that's not really a city, but it's a big town that grew way too fast and couldn't keep up. And so all of a sudden we have to contend with people being in our space, in like our bubble. So that creates a sense of like, so it's very cliquey here, very protective of like social circles. Everyone obviously remarks upon the nature. It's amazing, but there's only so much, you can do. And it's also quite a sleepy city, unless you have like word of mouth connections, maybe you'll be able to go to a rave once in a while, but it's generally like it shuts down after 10. It's not New York.
Well, I mean, in part, it's good for a grad student.
I was just gonna say,
like, actually, I probably shouldn't be, but yeah, I mean, I think when you say 3 years to figure stuff out, I'm like at that point now, and I'm like, yeah, I completely feel that. Like, just to be able to have some sort of root, right, somewhere,
exactly,
in some way, yeah.
Viktoria?
So what are my perceptions of Vancouver? So I guess just to like back it up a little bit, I moved to Canada in 2009, but I didn't move to a big city. I moved to a small ass town called Taber, Alberta.
Oh, wow.
Tabor. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Taber, Kourt. And so imagine, so I live, in Quezon City, Philippines. It's like millions of people. So I was used to like being out at like 1 a.m. and there being like public transit, at that time, because they were so easy to come by. But like, to go from, and that's super hot. So to go from all that to that chaos to like, this town of 10,000, where it was like super cold, and like I think the year I came, it was like -50 at one point, which is
oh my god,
not how you want to spend your first winter ever.
Yep.
So yeah, and then I moved to Edmonton a couple of years later because I just thought I really need to get out of this town by hook or by crook. And then a few years later, I decided to move to Vancouver because I thought it's just on the West Coast. It's close to the Philippines. The plane tickets are going to be cheaper. And it's a city. So, like if I wanted to see, I don't know, like assuming that like, for, musicians I like and all that come, they probably come to Vancouver before they come to Edmonton. So that was the whole thinking behind moving to Vancouver.
And the whole, like the Filipino community here is quite large. It's bustling.
Yeah. And honestly, like, when I was at UBC, I was part of this like Philippine Studies series group. And like, if not for them, don't think I would have made it out of my MFA alive, because, having that community just to unpack like all the microaggressions I was experiencing, that really meant a lot. But otherwise, I agree with your assessment earlier, Jen, that Vancouver is quite hostile, but like they won't let you know. They'll be nice, but secretly inside they're like wanting you to leave, or like don't join our party.
Yeah, it's very passive aggressive.
Yeah,
straight up aggressive, actually.
And what else was I gonna say? I think that's about it. So like weirdly hostile. Like I agree. Also said earlier, very very cliquey, and I live near English Bay, so I can't even swim in English Bay. So
yeah, because I'm always my partner's from Ontario, and he moved here, I guess it would be 5-6 years ago, and he's always wanting to go to the beach and stuff. I'm always like, but the flora count from the like sewage. Why do you want to swim in the water? It's pretty to look at. I'm curious, what do you guys have? Because you guys just started Diasporic Dynasty. What are your next plans? What are your next plans, and what are your visions for your group?
Yeah, so we are actually curating a night for the Vancouver Mural Festival in August. Yeah, so that's really exciting. So that will be our first like mini mini show, in the sense it's a pretty small cast of us, but it's our first like in-person kind of gig. So that's coming up. And I guess just generally speaking, you know, producing more stuff, you know, and like just trying to kind of get the word out there, and also just open up our space to people that we don't know. I think, you know, a part of our collective mission is to serve as a platform for BIPOC artists to experiment, you know, and or to have like a stage, right? Because I think, you know, there are opportunities here and there, right, to get on stage, but often like you have to pay for a class to like perform, right? Or you have to, you know, kind of be in the circle for long enough for people to kind of know who you are and what you're about, right? So I think what we're interested in doing is just kind of providing an opportunity that's a little bit more open and inclusive of people who might have a really great idea. Maybe they do art in like drag, or they do art in some other form. Okay, like how can we bring them in, and take down some of those barriers that there otherwise would be for performing.
That's amazing. It's almost like a mentorship, and where people can workshop their ideas in like a supportive and encouraging environment.
Yeah, it's reminding me of a conversation that we had with Paul Wong and Dana Claxton, like just having a space just to experiment and make mistakes too. Like, yeah, I'm. It's been making me think, Jen. You know, we've been thinking about how do we also create spaces for new and emerging artists as well, and having a space to just try things out and make mistakes, and how important that is.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, there's kind of this like idea of polishedness within the burlesque community of, you know, for a number to be, it has to be stage ready, it has to be, you know, really, really clean. And it's like, but we could also just like not like, you know, like things can, and this kind of gets into, you know, maybe there are different goals in terms of what that show is for, right? Like if it's kind of for a more commercial interest, like the cleaning stuff is, that conversation looks a little bit different. But in terms of just kind of putting art out there, you know, like as long as, you know, you have an idea of what you want to do, and you're not going to go up and be really problematic, like just be a space to experiment. I mean, some of the best shows I've seen, just like peeping into clubs like in New Orleans or like in New York, have just been people who like are like, here's my concept, like I'm just gonna see how it rolls out. And like there's something really beautiful about experimental stuff that you're just kind of in the process of making it while you're doing it, right? So the and I think, you know, even with like polished things, right, you still have a level of maybe some things change around when you're performing that number in a certain context. So what's to say we should make this divide between the polished and the unpolished or whatever? So yeah, I'm all for the space for just kind of like doing cool stuff, keeping it accessible.
Well said.
I love that you bring up the word polish, because I was just thinking about that, because I don't know why, you know, it's like mostly white people. Why do they not realize that like stuff will make its way back to BIPOC people in one way or another, calling their stuff unpolished, and, you know, and in really not constructive way. So, you know, I totally agree. Like, you know, having just having the opportunity to provide a platform to, you know, unpolished performers to like, you know, hone their craft. Because, you know, who's to say what their intention is, right? Like these performers, like, you know, and that's the, you know, the kind of the point of, I think at the root of it, like, you know, performance isn't about polish. Like, I don't think that audiences are going to remember how polished your number is. Like, I think they're going to recall, like, remember more like the feelings that they got when they watched your number, and not like where you messed up or anything like that. So
it makes me think about, like, you know, Jen, we often always emphasize like the process instead of the outcome, and also the content. Like, what is the work that this project is intended for, right? And and I'm also just thinking, I don't know, I'm just also thinking about, we've had these debates about even our social media presence, you know, everything at one point we were like, oh, everything needs to be polished. It needs to have a certain aesthetic. But we're
Ugh,
also just thinking now, you know, what is
we're
the,
over
what,
it.
yeah, so over it. And also, what are we trying to communicate? Are we getting it across? Why are we spending hours trying to make something
Says the
different?
person that designed,
That's,
like, had
yeah,
a 30-second intro that you cut and edited together for Hot
for
Pot
Hot Pot
Talks with
Talks.
the Hot Pot Talks signage behind you. Okay. Okay, I'm the one that's messy and loose, and David has to like ring me in. So I don't know if we have time to talk about this, but I'm actually just really curious. I want to get to know you two even more deeper, just in terms of like how you grew up, and also whether there's any like stories as like a child where you had a shift in your analysis. Do you have like those moments, you know, where you were like, oh, this is what I want to be when I grow up, or this is what set the plant, or this is what planted the seed for when I would become A, B, and C.
Yeah. So, like I said, I grew up in New Jersey. So my dad is Senegalese. My mom is like also New Jersey, very New Jersey, like grew up in Hoboken or whatever. So I had an interesting upbringing in terms of, I mean, like not to get into the weeds of it, but like kind of trying to figure out like two different sides of the family, like raised by primarily the white side, you know, my dad being an immigrant, right? So Black American means something different for me than maybe it does for other people, right? So yeah, I guess just generally speaking, I feel like I didn't have like a an oh shit moment until maybe like college. Like it was like a while. Like even now, I'm still just kind of like, okay, like I'm a mix of many different things, and that's okay. Like I don't have to like, I don't know, fit into this like tragic mulatto story of like, oh, like I don't belong to either side. It's just like, let it be, just be yourself. Everything's going to be fine. So in terms of like, you know, the point of analysis and identity, probably when I moved to Vancouver, I feel like I started having kind of more of these conversations with myself, because like it was even more of a jarring place to come to, and trying to kind of think about like, okay, maybe my experiences as a Black person are different than someone else here, but we're still kind of under this umbrella of how people treat us and act towards us, right?
Yeah.
And then in terms of just like what I do, I think I've always just been into school. Like school's just, I always did well at it, and I just enjoyed being a nerd. So I was like, okay, like this seems like the natural step. I actually have 2 master's degrees.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's really stupid. Like in the same discipline, which is a whole thing. But like, so I did a lot of work that way. And then in terms of burlesque, I mean, I've always been into really like Rocky Horror stuff. I was in a cast, and the more kind of, you know, punk-esque kind of stuff as a teenager. It all just makes a lot of sense down the line. So yeah.
Cool.
Oh, Viktoria,
can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yep.
Okay. So for me, I grew up in the Philippines. So, you know, I was just raised by primarily by my mom. And so let's see, kind of my childhood experiences. I was just thinking about to like my experiences in performing. I think the first time I performed was in like nursery school, where I had to be like an angel for a nativity scene.
Oh, wow.
But I was actually kind of like, I remember it being in my head, like, why is she the Virgin Mary? You know, one of my classmates, and you know, who picked her? Like, you know, why is she differently dressed than the rest of us?
Oh my God.
So, you know, already like, you know, wanting to take that spotlight. And then, and I was in kindergarten, we also had, I remember very distinctly for our graduation ceremony, we had to like dance my entire class in this like 90s song. It's like the lyrics song goes something like, last night I heard my mama singing a song, chirp, chirpy, chirpy, chirp, chirp, something, something. You're familiar with that, but like I didn't really know the choreography. And so I was just following whoever was in front. I don't know why I missed rehearsals, but I guess something else was going on. And then I guess when I realized I couldn't really dance was in like grade 1, where we had to do 5 of us. We had to do dance to like Pearly Shells, which is, you know, complete with like a grass skirt and like,
Oh, wow.
you know, like fake bras, which is like, oh my God, like why? Like, and I have pictures of it. So, and it's just like, why?
Yeah.
This whole existence is why. So, you know, and then, and I remember very distinctly, like while rehearsing that, I heard a mom say, it's like, oh, she kind of dances a little bit stiff. And that kind of stuck with me for the longest time. So from that point on, I just convinced myself that I actually couldn't not dance.
Oh my God.
These like aunties.
It's incredible and also infuriating how one person's, I don't know, like comments as a child that will stay with you for the rest of your life. Like I still hear certain words and comments that are like in the back of my mind from like very specific moments and memories that just add to your insecurities, or they somehow inform who you are as a person, that is a flaw, or like that is like just part of who you are.
Yeah. It didn't take me until like I was actually in Vancouver. It's like, oh, actually, you know what? I don't have 2 left feet. I can kind of dance. So, and I think as a child, I think I was always drawn to these. So when I was growing up in the 90s, that was kind of like the boom of like, you know, what we would call like titillating films in the Philippines. So like kind of softcore porn, but they're also for some reason like really mainstream. So I remember like walking to school, there would be like huge billboards of like movie posters that were hand painted, which is kind of a dying art now. And so I always just kind of remember like walking by, it's like, like look at this naked person, or almost naked person. I always kind of was kind of drawn to that. And, you know, you see them a lot in like magazines, like, and they were just very pervasive. And I think that also kind of stuck with me. And also I think influenced how, you know, I kind of want Viktoria to be inspired by these bombshells. And in terms of like my experience as a Filipino, I don't think I didn't really reckon with it until I got here. It's like, oh, I am an immigrant. But it's also a different experience from somebody who grew up here, because, you know, I think like 2nd gen, 3rd gen, they have their own set of struggles, which I don't necessarily, you know, relate to, because that's just not my experience. But, you know, of course, which kind of also highlights like, I guess this is the space that I'm in, and you know, kind of neither here nor there, because I don't know if I can like still live in the Philippines, to be honest.
Oh, really? So when was the last time you went back home?
I went back home like December 2019, which was for a wedding. So I was there for like a week. But yeah, I guess I just can't see myself like permanently settling there with just like the kind of person I am today. And, you know, and the skill set that I have, like, I don't know if I could survive Metro Manila.
Yeah. I mean, politically, it's kind of a mess right now over there.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah. Okay, well, we are running short on time. We're running out of time, actually. This always goes by very fast. Is there anything you would like to talk about? Any last minute words that you'd like to share?
We should ask the favorite hot pot ingredient.
Yes.
We ask all of our guests, what's your favorite hot pot ingredient or hot pot experience? We're putting you on the spot.
There's been a diverse range of answers, so it's okay.
So I think I've only done it once in Vancouver. So I feel like I don't want to make any sort of claim, because I haven't had a whole range. Like, wow, that's like the most boring answer. But I will say that one experience I had in Vancouver was very good. So I will take your recommendations for other places as well.
Cool.
Great.
for me, that's a really good question. I can't believe I didn't put thought into this since it's about food. Any sort of meat, I guess. I'm very fussy about vegetables, but meat not so much. So I guess that's my answer.
Cool. That's like me. Well, I'm not that fussy with vegetables anymore, I guess. But yeah, any meat.
Okay, well, thank you both so
Thank you
much for
both.
this conversation. This was such a pleasant, it was so lovely. I was in a very good mood this morning, and so I'm so happy that this could continue till late.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you
so much
both.
for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're
Cool.
huge.
Should we announce next week's?
Yes, let's
guest?
announce our next week. I'm losing my
Next week, I think we're talking to
Chi Tam.
Chi Tam. Yeah, we're calling it Changing the Flavor of Labor. We had a really interesting conversation about her work doing labor organizing, doing organizing in Chinatowns. We learned a new term, boba liberalism, which we're going to get into as well.
Yes, we love to talk about that.
Yeah, so stay tuned.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.